to stop. Okay, sorry about that. I want to go to share screen and go back to Cyber Campus and go back to the assignments. So some of you hopefully all got the notification on SNS from your phone on Saturday that there is the first weekly paragraph assignment due Thursday in the morning, this coming Thursday, 9 September by 7 a.m., that you should submit a paragraph to 150 words, at least 150 word paragraph, taking a position on this debate topic. To South Koreans, the Cold War was a necessary condition for European integration to be effective. So was the Cold War necessary? Did the Europeans and the Americans have to share a common enemy? Did they have to believe they had a common enemy in order to like each other enough and want to work with each other sufficiently in order to allow the European Union to work? I mean, these countries in Europe, they have been at war for many, many centuries, either preparing for war, fighting war, or recovering from war. And then in 1945, they stopped. Why did they stop? Why did they launch this integration? How important was American domination? How important was American hegemony? Whether was it nice hegemony or was it cruel hegemony? Was it American influence was so overwhelming that the other countries of Europe had no choice but to listen to the United States when the Americans basically, I would say, well, demanded that they cooperate with each other if they are going to receive vast amounts of American aid and assistance to Western Europe to recover from World War II. And the more important question is, well, not the more important, but another fundamental question is, why did the Americans give or provide this aid and assistance to Western Europe immediately after the Second World War? Why did they do it? Did they feel bad about the suffering of Europeans? Maybe a little bit, but that wasn't the main motivation. The most important motivation was the American belief that they needed to get Western Europe stable economically and politically, because the Americans believed the Soviet Union was a Russian version of Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin wanted to do what Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany tried and failed to do. And Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union was in a much better position than Hitler's Germany, having conquered Eastern Europe on the way to conquering Berlin and defeating the Nazis. They also occupied half of Europe. On the way, the Soviet army occupied half of Europe. And the Soviet Union won the war, didn't lose the war. And the Soviet Union was a country that was advocating a new way of organizing politics and economics after the bad experience of what capitalism and democracy had produced, giving rise to the Great Depression and the rise of Adolf Hitler. I mean, Adolf Hitler came to power through an election in 1933. And that was a result of democracy. Stalin and the communists are saying, we don't need that kind of democracy. The world doesn't need that kind of democracy. We have another way. We have another path that we can offer to you, the peoples of the world that are suffering so much. And so the Americans believed the Soviet Union was a greater, more dangerous threat than Hitler's Germany because it had socialism as an ideology that it was offering to the world, that was claimed it was offering, socialism and communism. And after the experience of the 1920s and 1930s, with the great inflation in Germany and the Great Depression in the world and the rise of Hitler through democracy, democratic elections, there was a lot of concern that a lot of French workers and Italian workers and others would listen or be very susceptible to being influenced by such propaganda. And keep in mind, I mean, I told you that my father is Italian, right? His in his youth, the Italian Communist Party was a very popular political force in Italy partly because the Italian Communist Party, they claimed the leadership in fighting the fascists. That the Italian Communist Party fought against Hitler's Germany when they occupied Italy, when Italy attempted to change sides in 1943 when it was losing the war. And the Germans then occupied Italy when it tried to change sides and join with the Americans and the British and the French and the Soviets. And they occupied the northern half of Italy and put Mussolini in power as their puppet in what was called the Italian Social Republic. And the Italian Communist Party led the resistance, the guerrilla warfare against the occupation. Same is true in France, that the French Communist Party played a leading role in the French resistance to the extent it was successful or effective. And that's evident, for example, in this passport that I showed you, my Italian passport. Look at this passport. This passport was adopted after World War II, and this is the symbol of the new Italian Republic after World War II. And notice what you see here. You see a red star. You can't see there's no color in this picture, in this symbol, but that's a red star, communist power star. And then you see a gear, like in a factory for a machine in a factory, gears, and you see wheat and grain, right? Another grain are being grown here. Peasants, workers, Soviet power, just to show you how influential the Italian Communist Party was immediately after World War II. And so the Americans were really concerned. And so was the Cold War necessary to motivate America and its friends in the governments of the post-war states of West Germany and France and Italy, De Gasperi, Adenauer, other leaders in Western Europe? They needed a common enemy to motivate and persuade their people to cooperate with each other to begin European integration, with the pressure from the Americans, with the Americans motivated by a belief that what happens in Europe will ultimately affect the well-being of the United States. What happens in Korea will ultimately affect the well-being of the United States. What happens in Vietnam will ultimately affect the well-being of the United States. That we have to fight these wars in Korea and Vietnam and resist the Soviet Union expansion in Europe, because if we don't, eventually the Soviet Union will dominate Europe and Asia and Africa, and then eventually turn its attention to surrounding the United States and dominating the United States. So that's the controversial question. How important was the Cold War in making European integration feasible? And now, of course, we don't have the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union is gone. Can the European Union thrive and survive? Well, that's an important question. I mean, after the United Kingdom left the European Union, would that have ever happened if the Cold War was still going on, that the British would leave the European Union if there was still a perceived threat? Will the Europeans and the Americans, not intentionally, but collectively, seek for a new enemy in order to help it easier to make them cooperate with each other? Maybe the People's Republic of China. Remember, these are all important questions, because the European Union claims to be a strategy for peace in Europe and the world. But is it going to try to create new enemies to make it easier to continue to integrate? Is it going to try to look for an enemy? Is it going to push Russia and China to be allies against a European Union that's just innately hostile to Russia because it was born during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was the form of Moscow's state, of what is Russia then? So I'm going through these questions to show you how this question is really important. And then, of course, the plan is that we will then have a debate on the Friday during our 2-hour class, and I will divide the class into groups, and some will be pro and some will be con, and then we will have a debate in class, and then we will vote on the Cyber Campus vote function here as to who won the debate. And of course, we'll do all of this online, and it's easy to do online. Okay, so I need you to submit that by Thursday, 9 o'clock in the morning, so that I can write comments on your paragraphs and send them back to you, all right, with my comments. Please be sure to use and cite information from the readings. And now I know you don't have the book yet, but you do have the notes, and I uploaded these notes. And here you see my notes from the textbook. So, and then, oh, that's interesting. It stopped let me see if I can open up those notes here. And so here are the notes. And so you see I have, these are 29 pages of notes. So I basically went through both chapter 1 and chapter 2, because chapter 1 was for last week, but we didn't get really organized. So I assigned for this week chapter 2. Let me show you the lesson plan again, if I can do that without confusing the computer. So then we have to share screen. So yeah, you see this week I assigned chapter 2. Chapter 1 is an introduction to the European Union, and we can go through that now. So I know you don't have the book yet, but you do have my notes, and my notes are basically organized to help you use the material in the book without having the book. And I even show you where each of all of the information is located. So all of this you see end page 1. That means everything from here up is from page 1 of the book, and this is all page 2 right here. And so so let me ask you a question, because I do a lot of talking. And go back to screen share, and let me also open up an exercise. Let me see if I can find the exercise here. And I think I already, okay, let me just open up the exercise, vote. And so do you think the European Union needs a common enemy against which to ally themselves in order to create the European Union? So please respond to this question. Please vote. The Europeans needed a common enemy against which to ally themselves in order to create what today is the European Union. Could the European Union have been created or started without the Cold War? And we'll just spend a minute on that. And so please vote. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. I just want you to think about these questions as you think about your paragraph that you will write. And neutral cannot decide. One agrees, right? And I think, I don't want to spend more than a minute on these things. And so far, 2 are neutral, cannot decide. And again, I guess there's lots of different implications of the question. If we're going to create an East Asian Union, like Hatoyama would like to create, and other leaders in South Korea and China and Japan have said over the years, do you need a common enemy, a common adversary? And is that common adversary going to have to be one of the Asian countries? Is it going to have to be Japan or China if you want to integrate the peoples of Asia? And so we've got 3 people, 2 more people should vote. Time's passing, 15 seconds. 1 more. 2, 3, 1 more. And okay, 1 more, 1 more. Okay, time's up. So the class seems to be split down the middle, and that question continues to emerge. Even if it's true that European migration happened significantly because of the Cold War, and the Cold War was necessary, does that mean, for example, the European Union is inherently an actor that has tremendous amount of history vested in opposing Russia? Is the European Union intrinsically a threat or perceived to be a danger to Russia? Is the European Union basically, as some people have argued, the European Union is one side of a coin, right? On one side of this coin is North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the European military alliance the United States created and inspired during the Cold War to help contain the Soviet Union. But on the other side is the happy smiley face of the Euro-Atlantic Alliance, and that is the European Union. That the European Union is basically an organization international organization that facilitates the cooperation of Europeans to be good allies, secondary level powers serving American hegemony in Europe and the world. Is that inevitable? Is that built into the DNA of the European Union? And does that mean if the United States is going to get into a conflict with China, that Europe will automatically also become an enemy of China because America's escalating its conflict with China because they're just too closely interconnected as two sides of the same coin? Is that inevitable? Is that impossible to prevent? What about hostility to Islam and political Islam? The Americans are at war against political Islam and pan-Arabism. Does that mean the European Union is automatically also going to be an enemy of political Islam because the Americans are an enemy of political Islam? Because they're so closely connected to the United States? These are all critically important questions, you know, and I have to say, I want to believe that the European Union is a great project aiming for peace and prosperity in the world. But I have to say that the European Union is not, standing up much to the United States these days. It just doesn't do it. It doesn't believe it can. I don't think that's the prevailing view in Europe. The prevailing view in Europe is that they need the United States. They need the United States for European integration to happen. And so if the United States is doing bad things or unfortunate policies, the Europeans can complain and protest, but they will not resist the United States. And for that being good or bad, I mean, they agreed under NATO, the Germans, the British, the Turks, other countries in NATO, in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization sent soldiers to Afghanistan, fought in Afghanistan, killed in Afghanistan, and look how well that turned out. If the Americans bomb Iran, what are the Europeans going to do? Are they going to try to stop the Americans, or are they going to acquiesce and not get in the way? If the United States bombs Iran because Iran's a threat to Israel and America's friends, Saudi Arabia and other feudal regimes in the Persian Gulf. Big questions. I mean, Europeans have already bombed America's enemies. It was the Danish Air Force and other European air forces bombed Libya in 2011 to help overthrow Muammar Gaddafi. Not the European Union, but NATO allies, including the Danes, the French, the British, the Americans. And look how well that turned out. Libya is shattered as a state. It's a main departure point for refugees trying to get across the Mediterranean Ocean to the European Union, and thousands of people have drowned trying to cross that sea border over the last decades between the Mediterranean, to get over the Mediterranean Sea from Libya to try to get to Italy or Greece or France in order to enter the European Union, because Libya as a state basically has been destroyed. Libya, there is a Libyan central government, but it doesn't control the territory of Libya. Libya is divided up into a patchwork of different political entities fighting each other. So again, this is our short class. So the European Union, I think we covered a lot of this already in last week. So I want to make sure we cover chapter 1, chapter 2. So I'm going to move ahead to chapter 2, and because that is the assigned reading for the week. So chapter 2 highlights the history of the European Union, and so we'll get to chapter 2 here, and you can see here's chapter 2, yeah, I mean, the author of the book does note that the Cold War and the intense conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union provided political support within the alliance of the countries with the United States, allied with the United States, to pursue integration without having to worry so much about their security interests and fears and concerns regarding each other. France towards Germany, Germany towards France, Italy towards the other West European countries, because the American military, at one point, the American military had 100,000 soldiers just in Western Germany. There are American military bases still in Italy, in Germany. So these countries didn't have to worry so much about preparing for the worst, preparing for the worst possibilities in dealing with each other, because the Americans, they believe that the Americans would not allow their allies in Europe to threaten each other. So Europe moved towards unity, and the United States played a critical role. It permitted the Europeans, as I said, to focus on cooperation, economic development, and not worry about the security dilemma that, well, we're in a normal, typical situation. A country is aware that no one will take care of themselves but themselves, right? No country can be responsible for its ultimate well-being other than that country in the world as it exists today, because there is no world government. So countries have to prepare for the possibility that the worst situation might emerge. So you build an army, because your neighbors today might be nice today, they might be friendly today, but who knows who will be in power in your neighboring country tomorrow? You can't be certain that they'll stay nice. So you have to be prepared. So you prepare by building a military, which of course threatens your neighbors. Even if you are an actor who declares, I don't want to threaten anyone, still you have to prepare for the worst situation just in case it emerges in some time in the future. And your preparation for that worst case possibility means the other countries have to feel insecure, will feel insecure because you're building up your military, and they have to prepare for that worst case situation possibility for themselves as well. So this is the so-called security dilemma, that one country's efforts in a world of anarchy where there's no world government to provide security, means that they have to prepare to defend and protect themselves. And that's always a concern, right? Like, let's compare with Korea. I don't need to worry about being hurt or robbed or killed in South Korea. When I walk down the street, I believe that there's a Korean government with a Korean police force and a Korean population that obeys the law, wants to obey the law. So I don't have to worry about, I have to carry a gun because, nobody's going to protect me but me. And, I always have to prepare for the worst case scenario. That doesn't typically exist in well-developed countries like Korea or Belgium or France. But in the world level, at the world of the international system, there is no world government. So France does have to carry a gun. The United States does have to carry guns. And of course, me carrying guns, the United States carrying guns is going to make nervous other countries, because the Americans might become less friendly because of a new government. Donald Trump or somebody might come to power. So these European countries didn't have to worry about the security dilemma, because American military power was everywhere in Western Europe at the end of World War II. After conquering Germany and occupying Western Europe, Americans stayed. And so they have to worry about the security dilemma in the relationships with each other. And the United States provided vast economic resources to contribute to this economic recovery. Again, not because they were nice guys, but because they thought these West European countries, after World War II, after the devastation of the war, after the bad experience of capitalism, that they might well be open or weak to maybe the Soviet Union would not necessarily invade those countries, because the Americans had nuclear weapons. And the Americans would have the nuclear weapons. It's the only country to have nuclear weapons for 4 years. The Soviet Union would test its first atomic bomb in 1949. So from 1945 to 1949, the Americans might not have to worry too much about a Soviet invasion, although they did worry about it. But they did have to worry that the voters and the peoples in these countries might be attracted to communist parties that would be listening too much to Moscow and Joseph Stalin. And then, of course, when the Soviet Union did develop nuclear weapons, then the Americans did become concerned that maybe the Soviet Union would invade Western Europe, because the Americans were not willing to fight a nuclear war with the Soviet Union and risk losing American cities by atomic bombs from the Soviet Union to defend Berlin or Paris or Rome. And so, and of course, Europe was declining at the time. I'm saying the Cold War was an important factor. The question is, how important was it? Other people and argue about this, and there's not agreement about how important was the Cold War, how much the leaders of Western Europe share this concern. And these leaders that we talk about that were leading Western Europe at this time, they were people like, let me open up a file here. The European Union website has lots of files to show in classes for teachers like me to use. So you can see here are the founders. Konrad Adenauer was the post-war prime minister of Western Germany. Winston Churchill was the leader of Britain who came back into power after being voted out in 1945, but he advocated a European integration, but he said Britain should not be part of that European integration. Britain still had the British Empire and had hopes of being powerful and influential on its own in the world. And so even in the late 1940s, there was ambivalence or mixed feelings in Britain about what to make about European integration, even though they supported it. Alcide de Gasperi was the liberal democratic leader of post-Mussolini, post-fascist Italy after World War II. And these are two Frenchmen. Jean Monnet was a civil servant in the French government who developed a plan that became the European Coal and Steel Community. And then Robert Schuman was the foreign minister of France. He's got a German name, but he's French. He was the foreign minister of France who adopted Jean Monnet's plan and to promote the European Coal and Steel Community in the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris is where the treaty was signed that created the European Coal and Steel Community that came into effect in early 1950s. And then there was I think a Belgian French woman who played a role as well, but she wasn't leader of the country, but she was an advocate of European integration. So back to the notes, and so let me make sure that you're able to see these notes. So the Treaty of Paris was the first step in the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community. It reduced some barriers to international trade and reduced international subsidies for these sectors of the economy. So the idea was that we need to integrate our coal and steel industries for a number of reasons. But again, the most important was, this is almost 80 years ago, right? At this time, people think about war, they think about World War II. Big armies with tanks and trucks and rifles and artillery and lots of steel and lots of coal to make that steel, to make those weapons. And so if you integrate the coal and steel industries of Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, but more importantly, Western Germany and Italy and France, that it will serve to reduce fears and insecurity as the French can see inside of Italy and coal and steel industry, and the Italian can see inside the German coal and steel industry, and the Dutch and the Belgians and the Luxembourgers can look inside the French and the German coal and steel industries and see that they're not building up their steel to build new tanks and new trucks and new ships and new guns and new artillery pieces. And also to make their industries more efficient by relying upon the efficiencies that these countries can offer if they create one big coal and steel industry instead of a French coal and steel industry, a German coal and steel industry, an Italian coal and steel industry. If they integrate them and allow each of these different countries to contribute their most effective and efficient resources to these coal and steel industry, then the coal and steel prices will drop, and coal and steel will become more efficiently manufactured, cheaper, and more widely available for use in rebuilding these devastated economies. And to integrate the coal and steel industries of these 6 countries, they created a set of supranational institutions for governing this economic integration, and that included the high authority of the coal and steel community, which was the forerunner of the European Commission, and this supranational body was supposed to oversee this integration. This is the first time European governments have done this in the modern times, right? And then the Americans were saying also, you West Europeans, you need to cooperate with each other, because if we're going to give you all of this loans and get grants from the United States to rebuild your economies, we don't want you to waste that money in wasteful, inefficient economic competition with each other. We want you to cooperate and coordinate and collaborate, cooperate, coordinate, and collaborate in your economic redevelopment and recovery programs and reconstruction programs, so that this U.S. money in the form of grants and loans in the European recovery program will have the biggest impact, instead of being wasted in inefficient desires or demands that, we have to have our own complete French coal and steel industry and our own complete self-contained Italian coal and steel industry. No, no, no. And the U.S. supported the new institutions that were created at the end of World War II to try to prevent new Great Depressions and global economic catastrophes, like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, although it was called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade at the time. And it was signed at a ski resort, I think in New Hampshire, called Bretton Woods. That's the ski resort. That's where they met in 1944 to the delegates from the member states of what became the IMF and the World Bank to create these organizations. That's what we call them, the Bretton Woods system. It promoted free trade and the dollar, because keep that in mind, at the end of World War II, the United States alone, the US economy just by itself was close to half of the world's total gross domestic output. Of the entire planet Earth, nearly half was just the United States. I see different estimates, I see 37%, 40%, close to 50%. But the point is, the US, the overwhelming contribution, it was an overwhelmingly big part of the world economy as a whole because of the devastation of World War II. Keep in mind, the Soviet Union lost 27 million dead people in World War II, 27 million dead. 60% of its industrial capacity destroyed in that war. They would recover in 5 years. But the point is that if the world economy was going to recover, the United States needed to play the leading role because it was overwhelmingly the biggest economy. It was the U.S. economy, according to some estimates, say it may have doubled in size. From 1940 to 1945, the U.S. economy increased 100% by some estimates, although some people say less, but still a lot. Because so the U.S. was basically not really touched by World War II. It lost 400,000 men as soldiers, but that's a lot less than 27 million in the Soviet Union, obviously. And then in 1949, the U.S. created NATO when they became really, really concerned that despite the fact that they had been allied with the Soviet Union against Germany in World War II, by just a few years later, the Americans were concluding that the Soviet Union is a problem, a big problem. It aimed to counter the perceived Soviet threat. And but nationalism had always been a challenge in Europe. But of course, nationalism was really disreputable and had lost any kind of legitimacy as a political platform for a political party in Italy or Germany or France, because Hitler was a nationalist. He was an open nationalist, and Mussolini was a nationalist. And of course, that gave us fascism and Nazism in World War II. So nationalism was weakened as a value, collective value driving politics in these countries because of the experience of World War II, which again created conditions for promoting integration from people like I mentioned, these people who, they represented groups in European society that had always dreamed and thought and dreamed about a European Union, going all the way back to, in modern times, to Immanuel Kant at the end of the 18th century, right? If you go further in studying European integration studies, you'll have to read Immanuel Kant's Perpetual Peace Project, where he was building on some other work by French aristocrats in the 18th century, thinking about what can we do to make Europe, our community, Europe. We're at war with each other, killing each other, but we're all European. What can we do to stop these wars? And so these people were inheritors of those thoughts and desires and beliefs, but they, of course, were always pushed aside by the nationalists. But the nationalists were destroyed by World War II. And so these people, with the help of the Americans, emerged after hiding from Nazis and the fascists in Italy and the Nazis and the Germans. They came back into politics, and the Nazis and the fascists and the Japanese imperialists were swept away. And these people were left to dominate the politics in these countries along with the communists, but not the nationalists. So that's a critical point in terms of also, trying to explain how European integration came about. The Europeans, as the 1940s passed the 1950s, they started to become concerned about what the Americans were up to. Some US policies began to alarm the Europeans. The West Europeans may have been concerned about Stalin and the Soviet Union, but then Stalin died in 1953. And a lot of people I've spoken with, experts, believe that after 1953, as a whole, Western European allies of the Americans were a lot less concerned about the Soviet Union threatening and conquering Western Europe than Washington and the Americans were. After Stalin passed, the West Europeans did not see or perceive as much as an intense danger or threat from the Soviet Union as the Americans did. But at the same time, the West Europeans wanted to make sure that they kept the Americans as allies. So if the Americans pressed the Europeans to separate or distance themselves or take actions against the Soviet threat, they would do it, but not with much degree of enthusiasm. And that's critically important, right? I think that goes back to the video I was showing before the class started today. If you want to explain why the Cold War ended in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down, right? Any explanation has to include European integration in persuading the Soviet leadership in Moscow that Germany and Western Europe is not a dangerous threat to the Soviet Union. Germany and Western Europe are not a threat to the Soviet Union, and European integration has to be part of the explanation of why the West Europeans were able to persuade the Soviet Union and the Soviet leadership that they don't need to keep the communist regimes in power in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia to protect the Soviet Union from a new German invasion. They don't need to worry about a German invasion. That's not going to happen. But the Americans, I mean, I remember when I was in high school in the 1970s and into the 1980s, there was still discussion in the early 1980s in the United States about would the Soviet Union attempt to launch an attack into Western Europe from East Germany with the hundreds of thousands of Soviet armies, Soviet soldiers deployed in East Germany and Poland and Czechoslovakia to attack Western Europe. That Eastern Europe was a springboard. They were still talking like that when I was your age in the United States, but not so much the Western Europeans. They weren't talking like that. So, I remember even in the 1980s, the West Europeans began to buy lots of natural gas and oil from the Soviet Union. They built pipelines that still work to this day. They've helped fund the construction of pipelines from the Soviet Union territories to Western Europe because they needed the oil and gas. So clearly they didn't see the Soviet Union as a major threat. If you're going to be dependent upon the Soviet Union for oil and gas, you must not believe that the Soviet Union is a Russian version of Nazi Germany. Why would you become dependent upon them for oil and gas if you thought they wanted to conquer you? And the Americans complained, and the West Europeans resisted. But other times, when the Americans insisted that the West Europeans be more active, they would agree. The West Germans would agree, for example, to upgrade America's nuclear missile placements in Western Europe under the Pershing II missile program, and it was and that generated vast amounts of protests in Western Europe in the mid 1980s. Hundreds of thousands of people coming out of the streets and protesting in Germany and in Britain and Italy against the new American missiles that they were placing, nuclear tipped missiles they were placing Western Europe. The Americans claim they were doing it because the Soviets were putting new missiles in Eastern Europe. The point is, by the way, that those protests gave rise to the Green Party, what is today the Green Party, which is one of the main parties in the German parliament in Germany today. They began in those protests against the Ronald Reagan administration's deployment of the Pershing II missiles in Western Europe in the mid-1980s. Yeah, I mentioned there was always talk over the centuries even about how can we Europeans go back to a belief that there was a time when Europe was peaceful and powerful under the Roman Empire, and how can we recreate a time of peace and power in Europe when Europe is one of the centers of the world. And of course, there was the Roman Empire collapsed 1,500 years ago, but there was the memory of it. And the term European came into general use in around 800 AD when Charlemagne, which is a French word which means Charles the Great, emerged as the king of the Frankish Empire, constituting what is today France, much of Germany, and much of Italy, and Belgium and Netherlands and Luxembourg. He was crowned by the Pope in Rome as the Holy Roman Emperor. And then, of course, that didn't stop, obviously, war in Europe. The Charlemagne Carolingian Empire collapsed after Charlemagne died, and Europe entered a period of war and conflict. And then the Europeans, they found new enemies. So then the Europeans started looking to the rise of Islam and the threat of the Arab and Turkish Muslim conquests coming into Southeastern Europe as a threat. Again, having a common enemy or common threat in the form of Islam as a threat to Christian Europe. But that still didn't stop them from fighting each other as well, along with fighting the Turks and others that were coming into what is today Bulgaria and Greece and Serbia and Macedonia and Albania and elsewhere. So philosophers that you read if you study philosophy came up with political projects or blueprints for trying to end Europeans killing other Europeans. Jean-Jacques Rousseau advocated a European federation. So these ideas were always there. They're always floating around long before 1945, long before the Treaty of Paris in 1952. But it wasn't politically possible to implement these ideas until the destruction and devastation of World War II, the sweeping away of the nationalists and the dominance of the United States. Jeremy Bentham, another famous British philosopher, advocated a European assembly and a common army. Immanuel Kant, I already mentioned him, proposed a European peace through integration, building upon, and then of course, French aristocrat Comte de Saint-Simon on the reorganization of the European community. So these ideas were always there and people were talking about them, but they didn't have the political capacity to implement them until 1945. Napoleon tried to unify Europe, but he did it on the terms of French military conquest, like Hitler would try to unify Europe as well on the basis of German military conquest. And then the Great War, World War I happened. And this increased enthusiasm for discussion of European integration, but at the same time, the economic depression that emerged in the early 1930s led to also increasing support for radical authoritarians who were promising order through the brute force. And the Nazi leadership rejected the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, where Germany had been humiliated, and then of course we're not talking too much about World War II in this class, but that's always a point to keep in mind. That shadow of the 1930s and 1940s, we don't talk about it, but it's always there. It's always there today in 2021. Right? To this day, that you see, for example, certain countries are more enthusiastic about joining the euro than others, and particularly those countries that have a history of believing themselves to be friends and allies of Germany are quite willing to join the euro. So Croatia, they want to join the Eurozone, definitely. because they view the Germans as their traditional allies. The Baltic states traditionally, viewed the Germans as a counterpart against a counterweight against Russia, still to this day. And we already talked about how Lithuania has basically de facto recognized Taiwan as an independent country. It's in the Eurozone and, of course, in the Euro and NATO, in the European Union and NATO. And so the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is the European Recovery Program that the Americans advocated. And but the short slang term for it is named after the US Secretary of State at the time, George Marshall, who had been a US World War II general. And he was Secretary of State. And the European Recovery Program is called the Marshall Plan. And keep in mind how destroyed Europe was. There was hunger in Europe. People were dying of starvation in Western Europe right after World War II. And that's an important point to keep in mind as well. I mean, the Europeans are very protective of their agricultural sector, and through the common agricultural policy that is part of the core of the European Union policies. And one of the claims is because the Europeans remember the suffering and tragedy of the 1930s and 1940s. Britain was one of the winning side of World War II, but it was devastated as well by the war. And then it became clear that the British, even though they were a winner of World War II, that they could not continue to provide political leadership in Europe because they didn't have the economic resources to back up that leadership. So the Americans stepped in. As the Americans came to believe that, oh my God, we were not involved enough in Europe in the 1930s, and that made Hitler's rise and World War II more likely. So we must stay involved in Western Europe because the Soviet Union will get involved if we're not involved. And so the Truman Doctrine under Harry S. Truman, of course, who also led US during the Korean War, declared, without naming USSR, the Soviet Union, but the United States was publicly committed to protecting democracy in countries that are threatened by clearly the Soviet Union, including Greece and Turkey, supposedly. And then, of course, the Korean War would speed up the American commitment even further. Okay, that's where we have to stop today. Anybody have any questions? Okay, I will post everything I showed you here on the cyber campus. So thank you. If no questions, I got to get ready for the next class. So
thank you.
Bye.
Bye.